So I have every block accounted for. It's named A1, A2, A3, etc. So that I can keep up with all of those parts. So now I need to prepare a piece of fabric for every piece in this to send it through the printer, right? So when I send it through the printer, I have to convince the printer that it's actually just printing on paper, not printing on fabric. So I need to get the fabric all spruced up and ready to go so that I can send it through the printer without any problems. I also need to account for a seam allowance because I'm going to be sewing all these things together, and we're going to actually print a seam allowance into it so that if your sewing is not flawless, it's fine, that there's a little bit of wiggle room in there where it'll still line up nicely and you're not going to have like white gaps between your images. So in order to have enough room for all of that stuff, we're going to add an inch on the width of it, and we're going to add 3 inches on the length of it to make enough space for when we print, to have seam allowances, to have printer margins, to have room at the bottom for the printer to grab onto everything. So all of my squares are 4 inches by 4 inches, which means that I need to prepare fabric for printing that is 5 inches wide and 7 inches long, because I'm adding an inch on either side, and I'm adding an inch total to the width, and I'm adding 3 inches total to the height, okay? And that's kind of the bare minimum. There's nothing wrong with adding like 1.5 inches or 2 inches to the width. I've barely started. You do want to iron your fabric first. You don't want any creases in it. And what we're going to use to trick the printer into believing we are printing on paper and not fabric is we're going to iron it to freezer paper. It's different than wax paper. It's not wax on one side. It's actually a plastic that's going to essentially be melted to the fabric. So I'm going to roughly cut my fabric ahead of time. I know that I'm aiming for 5 inches by 7 inches. This is more than large enough. So I'm going to trim this down just a little bit ahead of time so I don't waste too much of it. So I want to give myself a little bit of extra room to trim it down better. So I've got 5 inches by 7 inches, and I'm going to iron it to the freezer paper. Once you get going with this, you'll probably do several of them at a time. In fact, why don't I go ahead and make both of these at once so I can line them up together. And I'm gonna iron the back of the fabric to the plastic side of the freezer paper. This orangish fabric doesn't really have a front or a back, but if you have something that's a print, you want to make sure that you're ironing the back of the fabric to the freezer paper so that you're printing on the front of it. You do not want to steam in the iron with the freezer paper because you'll end up wrinkling the freezer paper. And you do want to iron it well, because once we put stuff on this fabric, once we put the gel medium and the gesso and the digital ground and all that stuff, the fabric wants to peel away from the paper from all that wetness, so you do want to make sure that you iron it really well. So we'll trim it out, and now we're going to go finish the process over on the cutting boards. So you'll want to use your clear plastic ruler held in place, hold your hand firmly on it, and this is definitely something to like stand up and put your weight into. It's very hard to use a rotary cutter sitting down. I would also really recommend using this table. If you do cut over on your table, make sure you've got a mat with plenty of room around it so that you're not like overshooting it and slicing into your table, okay? So fingers well inside of your clear plastic ruler. You don't want to have your fingers out here with your rotary cutter. And you're always going to cut away from yourself. All right? So I've trimmed off one side. I'm going to spin it around. And do y'all remember how wide I want this piece to be? 5 inches wide, because I added an inch to it, because that gives me the 1/4 inch seam allowances on both sides, plus a 1/4 inch on each side for the printer margins. So I'm going to trim it down. So I've got a nice 5 inch wide strip of fabric. I'm going to trim my third side as close to the edge as possible, using all of the lines on my clear plastic ruler to get everything perfectly parallel and perpendicular. I'm then going to set it aside and cut out some cardstock to go on the end there. The cardstock is really key to getting the printer to believe that what it is doing is printing on paper. We're going to be coating this with wet media. This fabric is going to want to peel away from the back. So we're also going to seal these edges with more masking tape. So I'm going to take a strip of masking tape and I'm going to seal the edge. And I want to really err on the side of having a lot more tape on the back than on the front. You can kind of see what that proportion is. I want just enough to hold it in place on the front, because any more tape I put on the front is going to take away from my printable area. When I flip it over onto the back, oops, and I peeled that up so vigorously that I just unironed it a little bit. I need to iron that back down. When I flip it over, you want to be really delicate with how you seal that tape to the back. So I will fold it up and just get a little bit of a crease right there along the edge, and then I'll tap it down gently. So if you did not masking tape down these edges, after you put all the stuff we're going to coat this with on it, there's a good chance that it's going to peel away from the sides, and you're going to have to iron it back down, which means that you're ironing gel medium and gesso and like plastic stuff. It's like you just don't want to unless, if you really have to do that, you want to make sure it's super, super ventilated. So our last step is going to be to trim off this edge to make it that 5 inches by 7 inches size that we're aiming for.
So you wouldn't add for your paper, what you have on your paper, like you wouldn't make it 5 by 8.
Right, so that is part of the calculation. So when I say that we're adding a total of 3 inches in height, that takes into account giving a nice fat margin at the top and at the bottom. So this is ready to print now. Mine was getting coated with